Hello, this is Navin Girishanakar of the CSIS Economic Security and Technology Department. Welcome to this conversation on the prospects for a U.S.-South Korea economic reset, a discussion of opportunities and obstacles. Today we're going to seek to understand where we are in the trade negotiations between the two countries, the motivations of both parties, and their respective relationship with China. How will these negotiations likely play out in the coming weeks? South Korean and American negotiators have been feverishly working towards a deal over the recent weeks, amid shifting timetables for lifting the pause on Liberation Day tariffs, on and off again tariff announcements, and ever-changing benchmarks on what constitutes acceptable deals. While much attention is focused on the goods trade balance between the two countries and the cost of the defense umbrella, looking at the relationship through this lens, in some sense, is looking through the rearview mirror. Not all trading partners are the same, nor are all trade deals. Some, like this one, has significant geostrategic implications. So what are the prospects for a reset? A robust reset that's robust to the economic security challenges of the day, spanning trade, technology, relationships with third countries. To answer these questions, we have our best minds on the U.S. economic relationship with South Korea. Dr. Victor Cha, who is the president of our Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department and the Korea chair, one of our country's preeminent experts on Korea. We have Bill Reinsch, former undersecretary of BIS, as well as the Scholl Chair Emeritus and famously host of the Trade Guys podcast. And Erin Murphy, who's our Deputy Director for the India and Emerging Asia Economics Program. So welcome all of you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Let me start with Bill. Bill, let's start with understanding where we are and the motivations of the different parties, meaning South Korea and the U.S. I'm pulling up a chart here just to level set so people understand. And the team will pull up a chart on the trade balance between Korea and the U.S. and Korea and China. I know Victor has written a lot about this as well. Obviously, for the last 27 consecutive years, South Korea has run a goods services surplus relative to the U.S. You see that here on the left. The U.S. has, of course, run a services surplus, but it's meaningfully smaller. Obviously, on the right, you see the relationship between South Korea and China, again, has run a goods trade surplus until recently, where it's gone into deficit. But the point here is that there's meaningful integration with both the U.S. and the Chinese economies. It's something that I think we have to keep in mind as we think about how these negotiations play out. So lots of news, including the latest on a 25% tariff. Help us understand the context here, and then we'll go to Victor.
Well, the most recent event you just mentioned is that on Monday, the administration sent out letters to 14 countries, including Korea. They sent out 6 more today on Wednesday, so 20 countries total have gotten tariff letters. The letters, aside from the number, are all pretty much the same, which is, here's your number, effective August 1. If you choose to come back and make more concessions, we'll consider changing the number. So basically, this is a reprieve for countries that have been negotiating. South Korea has been in a little bit of a complicated position, as I think Victor will probably explain, because they've been a lot of political uncertainty in Korea, as culminated in an election in early June with a new president. So there's a new president, a new negotiating team, a new national security team, and they have had to scramble really to get up to speed on all the issues. They have resisted the administration's demands on a number of areas, and particularly sought for exemptions on tariffs on areas that are particularly important to them, which are steel, in particular, automobiles, semiconductors forthcoming. And so there's no deal. Whether there will be a deal in the next 3 weeks, we'll see. So they've got a reprieve. That's the current situation.
Yeah. Now, give me your thoughts on the motivations on the U.S. side. I mean, there's a lot of discussion in the media, but there's, interestingly enough, lots of thoughts on what the ultimate motivations may be. We know that there's a concern about the goods trade balance, but it could be more than that. So tell us your thoughts on that.
That's a good question. There's been a lot of speculation about that, partly because the president has said different things at different times about the goal. Sometimes it's rebalancing, making up for years of what he views as unfair treatment of the United States. Sometimes he's put out the revenue argument, we need more money. The biggest one, I think, for him personally is the reshoring argument. He wants to bring manufacturing, mostly traditional heavy manufacturing, back to the United States. And he thinks the tariffs is the way to do it. Biden actually had similar goals. His choice was carrots, which was subsidies and incentives to come back. The Trump approach is sticks. We'll put on these big tariffs and that will force you back. I think that's the main thing. In the Korean case and in the Japanese case, there's another argument that's floating out there, which is that what this may really be about is altering the overall relationship with China.
Right.
And the president's view is, how do we make the United States stronger technologically, stronger militarily, stronger economically, and how do we weaken China? Mm-hmm. And I think one of the arguments that comes up periodically on this is that one of the ways you do that, of course, is to strengthen the American economy, which is what he believes his legislation will do. But the other way to do it is to encourage other countries that have big trade relationships with China, which includes Korea, to move in the decoupling direction.
Right.
Not 100%, but in the de-risking direction. And that the Koreans, I know, having chatted with them, are expecting this to be part of the American demand, that they take anti-Chinese actions. And as they've said to everybody, I think it'll be very difficult for them to do that.
Yeah. So, for example, treating any Chinese content in transshipment is an issue that.
Well, yes, and that was mentioned in the letters that are going out,
right.
And it was explicit in the Vietnam Agreement where they put a number on it and said 40% tariff for transshipment, 20% for ordinary stuff. The letters that the 20 countries have got the last 3 days don't mention a specific number for transshipment, but they do mention transshipment. That's going to be a really tricky issue for the administration because it depends on how you define the term.
Yeah.
I mean, some transshipment is illegal, ship it to a third country, just put on a new label.
Yeah.
You can't do that. Some of it is not illegal, but complicated. So how you define it is important. How you enforce it, which is very difficult, is important. And if you really want it to have an impact on China, you've got to line everybody up to agree to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. So Vietnam may have agreed to that. Whether these other countries will agree to that or not remains to be seen.
Understood. Let me shift to Victor. Victor, you've written extensively about this, even anticipating how these negotiations may play out given the focus on the goods trade balance and the cost of the defense umbrella. But you're very close to what's going on there on the ground with the new government, the political economy just driving their motivations. Can you give us a window into what are the drivers and the motivations of the Korean side in these negotiations?
Thanks, Navin, and Bill's comments I think were terrific. I would say that the negotiations started for Korea at a time when they really had no team in place because for about 6 months Korea was in a crisis with regard to their impeachment and martial law. And so while the Trump administration was moving forward on a very aggressive tariff agenda with other trading partners, including Korea, Korea basically didn't have a team in place that, frankly, the Trump administration would take seriously because they knew that there was a good chance these people would not be in office. So the Koreans came into this with the election of a new government already a good 6 months behind everybody else, but with a very important imperative to try to negotiate as aggressively as possible. South Korea was being hit not just by the 10% reciprocal baseline tariff, they were being hit by the auto tariff, the auto parts tariff, the steel and aluminum tariff, as well as the tariffs on Mexico, one of the first tariffs that Trump put out against Canada and Mexico, but in particular Mexico, because there's a lot of Korean manufacturing that takes place in Mexico that then gets exported to the United States. And these things were having a real effect on the economy. South Korean growth numbers have been cut in half. The Bank of Korea cut South Korea's growth number literally in half in the second quarter. They reduced the base rate by 0.25 to try to loosen money supply. So these tariffs are having a real impact on the economy. And that is, of course, not good for a new government that doesn't have much of a honeymoon period. They need to try to finish this year strong because they have local elections within 6 months of the new year, which will be seen as a referendum on the performance. So there's a lot of incentive to move as quickly as possible. I think that they are looking, unlike many other leaders, world leaders, South Korea has not yet, 7 months into the Trump administration, South Korea has not yet had a summit meeting with the U.S. president. And as we all know, many of these tariff negotiations are going to be decided not by Trump's team, but by the president himself. And so I think the Koreans are looking at two potential opportunities this year. The first one being an immediate summit sometime where President Lee would come to Washington, D.C., and then the second, that being in the summer, and then the second time being if President Trump goes to APEC in Busan at the end of October. So they might start a negotiation with President Lee's trip here and then try to finish it by the time they get to October. I think that at least is part of the game plan. But again, there's an argument that could be made for they should watch what the Japanese are doing in their negotiations because they're ahead of South Korea. They should watch what happens with the International Trade Court decision and appeal, although that will probably take a long time to see what happens there. But I don't really think that they can wait because the costs for waiting are very high in terms of slower growth. Export numbers are down big time for Korea right now in the auto sector. And also, you mentioned your graph showed China. Also with China, exports are down with China because the South Koreans already are de-risking when it comes to China. So they're kind of de-risking from both the United States and China at this point. It's not an enviable situation to be in.
That is such valuable perspective. And I wanted to ask you about the China relationship because they're really squeezed right now. They're squeezed on the U.S. side with respect to the Trump administration's tariffs. On the other hand, if they don't find a safety valve or a release valve with respect to where they can export, an export-oriented economy, they will be in a very, very tough position. Could you just double-click a little bit on the China relationship and what's at stake and President Lee's approach to China?
Yeah, so President Lee has come in and he's talked about rebalancing the relationship with China. That is, his predecessor, Yoon Suk-yeol, the impeached president, took a very hard line on China. He was willing to do aspects of decoupling that the Biden administration was interested on, particularly on high-end technology. And many of the South Korean companies, SK and Samsung, were also making long-term strategic decisions to invest in higher-end stuff in the United States and not invest in China, maybe keep legacy products in China. And the previous government was also quite strong on Taiwan, more stronger than any other previous South Korean government. The Lee government has come in and it said that it wants to have more of a balanced relationship with China. He hasn't really defined that, but one can take that to mean both on the security side as well as on the economic side. One of the big decision points, I think, for the Lee government, I think there are two. One is, there have been really thus far two attempts for Lee to meet Trump. One was at the G7 in Canada. Yeah. Trump left that a day early because of the bombing of Iran. And then the NATO summit in The Hague, where Lee decided not to go to that.
Yeah.
At the summit in Canada, he went and was stiffed because Trump left early.
Yeah.
And I guess they didn't want to take that chance at NATO. So one of the big questions, I think, for the Lee government now is, do they do a meeting with Xi Jinping, before a meeting with Trump? And then the second decision is whether they go in September to the Victory Day celebrations. These are not directly economic related issues, but they are important signals, strategic signals of this effort to rebalance the relationship with China. Now, having said that, there is a general view in the South Korean body politic, as well as among South Korean industry, that while there are certainly opportunities in China and export opportunities in China, there are two additional issues. One is there is a broad view that China is an economic threat to South Korea in many industries, both in sunrise and in sunset industries. In addition to that, there is a history of China using economic coercion against South Korea, most prominently in 2016, 2017, when South Korea put a U.S. Missile defense battery in Korea, and the Chinese responded with massive economic sanctions. But also in cases like the supply of urea, which is used in diesel fuel, where the Chinese cut off supply of that, and that froze like South Korean railroads and delivery systems for a period of time. So I think the government is looking in the direction of trying to rebalance the relationship with China, and I think that also includes trade. But for the general public and for experts, I think that for them, it's not so much a move directly in that direction, but an overall bottom of assessment of what is the strategic value of China to Korea, both in terms of security and economics.
Yeah, fascinating perspectives. Let's hold those, because you have several points there around negotiating tactics and how that might play out. I want to come back to that. But first, let me go to Erin, because we've now got a picture of where we are on the sort of macro perspective here and the motivations. But let's drill down into the sectors. You put out a piece, I think a couple months ago, anticipating this, and you laid out some of the strategic sectors that are going to be important in seeing whether we can actually get to a deal. So could you give us a window into those?
Sure, and I think that Bill and Victor gave a bit of a preview as to what those sectors are and where the challenges are. Really primarily semiconductors, shipbuilding, so ships and chips, but also looking at broader technology, critical and emerging technology, and energy. And as Victor was saying, that it's not just the tariffs between the U.S. that it's imposing on the ROK, but also on steel and aluminum, on autos. All of that has an implication for how the U.S. is going to develop these sectors, but also if it wants to be a leader in these sectors, and that includes manufacturing as well, which Bill highlighted, you need to have partners, especially if that leadership also means competing with China. So just looking at the shipbuilding industry, Trump put out an executive order in April saying, we're going to be a maritime power again, we're going to build ships. We're coming from a very low point. Right now, we're producing less than 1% of global commercial ships. China is producing about 50%. But the next two largest producers of ships are South Korea and Japan, two treaty allies. So South Korea has already made steps of investing in U.S. shipbuilding, and this is really an area where we can go forward. They put in a $100 million investment, which was approved by CSIS, into the Philly shipyard, and have been looking at other places as well. For chips, the South Korea was a great beneficiary of the CHIPS Act, perhaps RIP, and going forward on that. But they've invested heavily in Texas and other states as well to help build out our semiconductor industry. And that also goes to manufacturing as well. Automobiles, other types of industries, primarily on the East Coast, but in the map that I think we'll see later is where they've gone. It's been all over the United States. So for us to be leaders in that, we need that partnership. So that's certainly affected as well. And then, of course, there's energy. Right now, it seems that the U.S. is putting off clean energy technology. If we look at the One Big Beautiful Bill, the tax credits for solar, for wind, those don't seem to be that they're going to be put in use anymore. But that doesn't mean that the world doesn't need it, and that doesn't mean that we need to forget about where our energy comes from. If we're going to be leaders in technology, and that includes AI and quantum, you need the power to be able to generate that technology. We already have an agreement, it's about 10 years old, signed in 2015 with South Korea on nuclear cooperation. This could be a great industry that we work together on, but when you have these tariff implications, it's not just the financial cost, it's also the cost to the relationship, being a reliable partner, being able to work together and going forward. I think we act as if these decisions are all made in a silo, but it really impacts the whole relationship going forward.
Yeah. You've laid out a number of sectors there, those related to the industrial base, the defense industrial base, chips, nuclear. Let's talk about digital services as well, because there's a flip side to this, right? Which is, the Korean market and whether it is open to U.S. exports around digital services. Obviously, there's much discussion around the so-called platform bill, the draft legislation on the Korean side, which is really around anti-competitive behavior, but can be viewed as a way to preempt, a preemptive measure to really cut out U.S. companies. That's at least the U.S. company perspective.
Right.
There's obviously the Korean perspective on data privacy, for example, being a national security issue. Can you tell us a little bit more about this particular sector?
It has been a real sticking point in the relationship. And, I think the Koreans have a lot to complain about right now with the tariff negotiations, but certainly American companies and others in the digital services realm have a lot to complain about when it comes to this. These online platform bills, and there's about, anywhere from 16 to 19 proposals that are going around. What it's really trying to do from the domestic perspective is to help protect SMEs, consumers, self-employed folks from competition from these larger platforms that just have a monopoly over online platforms, and that really make it hard for these SMEs and to compete. But also there's an argument about pricing for consumers as well. But I think what larger companies would argue is that it's not anti-competitive, and in fact it's really preferencing Korean companies. So there is this protectionist measure that goes through, but U.S. tech companies have been hit very hard, either by fines or other types of activities, whether it's corporate raids that we've seen in other countries, but it's been really concerning. So Apple, Google, Kakao, Coupang, they've all been fined to tens of millions of dollars. Qualcomm was fined over $800 million. That was a decision on the antitrust law in 2016, but that decision was upheld. So, I think they're still trying to push back on that. But with the new administration, this issue has come up again, whether or not Lee will go forward in pushing forward these proposals. He's looking to enhance the trade organizations that oversee this, including KFTC. And I think that's a big concern to companies. So I think what they want is a more competitive landscape that allows for greater cooperation and greater provision of digital services, especially where there's expertise and quality. But this extends to other areas as well, including cybersecurity and cloud services.
Where there are benefits to the South Koreans of U.S. companies providing some of these services, particularly in cyber. So let's go now into like the lay of the land of negotiations, for example. On this point. So if you look at what's been reported, Minister Yeo had come and really tasked with full-scale negotiations as they presented it, and the public reporting is that he's put forward in the last few weeks a manufacturing renaissance partnership, which is all the investment-related stuff that you've been talking about, investment in the U.S., even though, and I'm going to pull this chart up, the next chart, which is, let me just do that here, sorry, which is Korean FDI in the U.S. versus Korean FDI in China. Historic highs. If you look at billion-dollar investments from South Korea into the U.S. in emerging technologies, it is at an all-time high. And as you rightly said, I'm going to pull this up as well, they're all over the U.S. And you just take a look at this map. These are billion-dollar, like states with billion-dollar FDI or more. And these are in critical and emerging technologies. And obviously, they have benefited from the Biden-era legislation, but still, these are meaningful investments with jobs behind them. So I raise that because, in a sense, the manufacturing renaissance partnership, part of the July package, and I want to go to Bill on this, is really significant, but it's building on what's been happening recently, right? So the question is that going to be enough? And it doesn't seem like it, because there's also the question of, well, no, open up your market as well. So let's first talk about Korean investment in U.S. industrial renaissance, let's put it that way, and your perspectives on this, Bill.
I think you're exactly right that the tack that the Korean negotiators are taking is to emphasize that. Their investment in the United States is a great story. It's one of their best arguments. And the economics of it are one of their best arguments. As Erin said, these are not things that you can do by yourself. These are, particularly in the high-tech sector, these are accomplishments that really are going to be the product of cooperation between friends and allies, trusted trade partners, a model that CSIS has invented and promoted in the past. So it's, I think, the right idea. When I had a conversation with one of our career-level negotiators a while back, the question came up, our country's putting those things on the table.
Yeah.
And the answer was yes. So then the next question was, is that going to be good enough? And the answer was pretty clearly no, that they're welcome. These are good things. We're happy to have them. But what we're really looking for is barrier reduction and opening of markets. Now, this was a trade person talking. So I think that one of the problems that the Koreans are facing is that they're making the best possible case, and it's a very good case.
Right.
I don't think it's going to be good enough for the administration right now, and that gets back to the question of whether the administration will ultimately lower its standards if it can't get agreements otherwise.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm going to tee up a question here and go back to Victor, because on the one hand, President Trump, when he added the 25%, I guess, was it 2 days ago or
Right.
36 hours ago, and said you have till August 1st, he said you have to invest and build in the U.S., right? Which is what they've offered. But at the same time, there's another piece to it, which is that, no, you have to open up your markets, reduce non-tariff barriers, deal with things like the platform bill, which when you think about it, makes sense. Like if you want to rebalance trade, the pathway for the U.S. is probably going to be greater services exports to Korea in the short run. That's the fastest way to reduce trade imbalance. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, although that's not been Trump's focus. He's not, in the case of Korea, as far as I know, he has not picked out specific complaints.
Right.
With Japan, you don't buy our cars, you don't buy our rice. With Europeans, you don't buy our cars, you treat our digital companies unfairly. I haven't seen him single out a specific Korean action yet that he wants to have fixed.
Although Greer did point out the platform bill was an issue.
Well, yes, and that is a services case, which
Yes.
is a little bit unusual for the administration, because most of the negotiations have been
Yeah.
about goods, and most of Trump's focus has been on goods.
Yeah.
So will a services concession by
And
the
this might
Koreans
be a
enough?
positive thing if they broaden the aperture beyond just the orientation towards the goods trade balance to include services.
Oh, sure.
That's a positive thing.
It's a positive thing for us,
Right.
and for the possibility of deals.
And that's the challenge for the Koreans. So that's a good segue to Victor. So Victor, let's talk about services trade, because when you give us your perspective on the platform bill, because it's not simply a matter of tearing down non-tariff barriers and opening up the digital sector in Korea. There are real national security concerns on their side. Could you help us understand those or other perspectives from the Korean perspective that we should keep in mind? Oh, I think you're muted there for some reason.
Sorry, I was muted in case my dog
Yeah.
barked.
Okay.
There are a couple of things here. The first is, Bill is absolutely right. Greer may focus on the platform bill or cite that as being an issue, but for Trump, it's the $66 billion merchandise trade surplus that Korea runs. That's the only thing that he focuses on. I think you've heard me say this in other settings where, at least in the first Trump administration, every memo that went to the president for a phone call or for a meeting had to have 3 bits of information at the top: the name of the country, the name of the leader, and what the merchandise trade balance was with that country. So that's entirely what he fixates on. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to be the way this tariff deal is going to be done with the United States, because as you guys know well, we have a free trade agreement with Korea. In terms of tariffs, we're basically at pretty much at zero on both sides, and so it's going to be in sort of this area of non-tariff barriers and things like that. I mean, you're right that Navin, that in the chart that you pulled up shows substantial, significant long-term Korean investment in the United States in emerging and future technologies. That's where Korea has placed its strategic bet and its partnership for sure, both at the government level and the companies. Like in the last 5 years, Korea and Japan are the 2 largest foreign direct investors in the United States, like without question.
Right.
But I mean, and unfortunately, I think that the successes of the past have hurt the Koreans in this respect, because they used this strategy with Trump in his first term, and they used it with Biden as well. And the National Security Advisor for Korea was just here. He actually arrived on the day that Trump announced the 25% August 1st tariff. So it doesn't seem like there's a lot of coordination there taking place on our side. But I think that the problem is that that Trump has now pocketed that, right?
Yeah.
He just assumes that that's going to be part of the deal. And so that does require the Koreans to open the aperture. Beyond sort of tariffs, non-tariff barriers, to other things like digital trade, like defense, these sorts of things. Now, on digital trade, I'll say that from the Korean side, I think there's sort of 3 things that are going on here that that make this a difficult issue. I'm not saying difficult. I'm not defining difficult as a point as being like the Koreans are immovable on this, but just sort of what are the issues that they have to consider. The first, I think, is as Erin mentioned, is they have this sort of, especially for a progressive government, this political imperative to try to protect small and medium-sized enterprises. Right? Progressive governments generally are more anti-big business. I don't think Lee has the economic leeway to aggressively push that, to be sort of anti-Chaebol, given the problems they're having in the economy now and because of the U.S. tariffs. But there is sort of this political imperative to try to protect innovation, try to keep it Korean, try to help small and medium-sized enterprises, which may weigh against them trying to be more flexible on things like the platform bill, data privacy. On the other hand, there clearly is an imperative, I think, coming out of Wee Sung-lak, the National Security Advisor's visit to the U.S. here, that they have to enlarge, reset what they're going to do in terms of making something attractive to Trump. And so I think that's one tension they have to deal with. This political imperative to protect SMEs, but also the political imperative to try to enlarge the deal to make progress with Trump. The second, I think, as Erin said, is just, there is the protectionist trait, right? They clearly want to protect domestic markets and domestic industry from these very big, large foreign companies, Uber, Amazon, Meta, YouTube, Qualcomm, you name it. And as Erin said, like massive fines that they've placed against these companies. And then the third is the national security imperative. I mean, there is a reason that Korea pursues sort of a uniform data privacy law, because that is not just about protectionism, but it's also about the fact that they have, a national security imperative, a very potent and very aggressive cyber threat coming from them just across the DMZ from North Korea, and that I think also compels them to think about this in less localized terms and in much more sort of national imperative sort of perspective.
Yeah.
I'm not saying these things are immovable, because in the end, South Korea needs to export cars to the United States, right? They need to be able to, they want to make a deal on ships. Shipbuilding, as Erin said, the huge investment in this. Trump has opened up a whole opportunity for Korea in this area. Maybe it starts out in terms of shipyards and maintenance and overhaul before it moves to actual ship production, but there's a real opportunity there. And there's an opportunity on LNG also. This is something that Trump has explicitly stated with regard to
Yes.
Korea and Japan,
Yeah.
is Alaska LNG.
Yeah.
So you see my point. On the one hand, there are real imperatives for them that they feel that they have on things like data privacy. On the other hand, there very clearly there is a need, if they're going to be able to still have the U.S. market as a place where they're going to experience national economic growth, they're going to have to think about ways to broaden the aperture on everything from things like ships and LNG and defense industrial cooperation, which they want to do,
Right.
to things that they don't want to do, which are things like digital trade. Maybe, I don't know, Erin, how you feel about maybe agriculture too. They're going to have to sort of reinvent how they think about this trade deal with the United States.
Yeah. So this is a great segue on this question of reinvention. Before I go there, but let me just ask you one thing. What about full stack AI cooperation? Meaning, if you look at the AI stack from frontier models, inference models and training, chips and data centers, energy, digital platforms on which the AI models run, and importantly, at the very base, critical minerals that are needed to feed chips and so on and so forth. Is there not scope here for AI to become kind of the template or the frame through which they look at a reset? Because that's a composite of competitiveness, both for the U.S. and for Korea, composite of all the elements of competitiveness.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is. You think it is. I think everybody at this table thinks it is, but somebody's got to convince the president. If he happens to be watching this episode, which I doubt, somebody has to convince the president that that is sort of another area where they can generate a lot of potential cooperation. It was clearly singled out by the previous administration as one of the frontier issues of cooperation and expanding the scope of cooperation in the alliance, but absolutely. And also in terms of critical minerals, I mean, Korea has joined the Mineral Security Partnership. There have been actually some experts have written reports about critical mineral resources in North Korea and potential opportunities there, because we know that Trump does want to eventually re-engage with the North Korean leader. So, I think there are all sorts of in the box and out of the box opportunities, but he needs to be convinced by his team and by his advisors and by the South Koreans that this is an area where there's a lot of opportunity for the two countries.
And it's interesting that there are really only two countries with full stack capabilities, China and Korea, and so that's a good reason. And at the same time, there are also Chinese AI data centers that, or PRC linked AI data centers that are being built in Korea as well. At least one of them that we know. So there is contested area here. So from a geostrategic point of view, the U.S. may want to think about this, but. Welcome your thoughts on that.
That's an important point. That's an important point, Navin. And there, I think we have to think about the politics of this also, because China's not going to be sitting on its hands while the South Korean government is trying to decide, should we continue to just push really strongly with the United States, even though we're making no progress. The Chinese are not going to be sitting on their hands, right?
Yes.
They're going to be proposing things to the
Absolutely.
South Koreans on AI, on other sorts of things. Xi Jinping has already put out that he's going to come to APEC in October, right? Erin, I don't know the last time Xi Jinping went to APEC outside of China. I don't think he's ever gone to APEC outside. I could be wrong, but But that's clearly calculated, right? They're
and if
trying
we're
to step
offering
into the
sticks
gap.
and they're offering carrots, like how long is this going to be tenable?
Right, and again, especially because all politics are local, and like I said, he's going to end 2025 maybe hitting the 0.08% growth number, but maybe even falling below that.
Yeah.
And 6 months later, he has an election where people will say, the opposition will say, this is a referendum on the first year in government.
Yeah.
And so he's going to be facing a lot of pressure to produce results. And if it doesn't come with the U.S., he may look to China, and he's already talked about looking to China. So it's something that we have to also be considering as well.
Great. So let me shift to. That's a challenging situation for the South Koreans. Let's shift to potential templates, or let's just say guideposts for where this could go. You mentioned Japan, but the thing that struck me, I was in London last week, is if you look at the UK-US prosperity deal, as well as ongoing conversations around a potential tech deal, and you put them together, I wonder if that could be, let's just say, guidepost. I wouldn't say model, I wouldn't say template, but a guidepost for where the US-Korea relationship can evolve, meaning integrate tech within that story. We've already been talking about it. And so I would just add to that, and this is more a question to Erin here, is like, what about the scope for R&D cooperation and allied R&D cooperation as a way of driving innovation both for the Koreans and the US? So you could look at innovation as, well, we need to protect innovation and our ownership over it, or we can say, let's go in together. There is some discussion on the Trump administration side of what tech alliances could look like. Very, very, very early discussions. What is your perspective on this?
Well, I think when it comes to R&D, this is a good example of it's not just investment dollars, but it's capacity building, people-to-people exchanges, but also getting to where that leadership is in AI and quantum and other critical and emerging technologies, including biomanufacturing and biotech. I mean, again, if these countries want to be leaders, it does take cooperation to do that. And this goes to a variety of fields, both for commercial usage, but also for military usage. When we're talking about shipbuilding, there's also an R&D element here where we're already starting to see cooperation with Palantir, Anduril, and other South Korean firms about having autonomous naval assets that are able to operate that way. Victor mentions the North Korea angle, working on cybersecurity and through technological cooperation there as well. But, joint R&D can go in a variety of the sectors that I was mentioning earlier, including on semiconductors, on AI. That also includes governance and what frameworks are going to basically shape the development of these critical technologies going forward, and also in the digital realm. R&D also goes to energy. As we're developing this nuclear cooperation, there's so many new technologies that are coming out, whether it's the small modular reactors or refurbishing reactors that have sort of been put to bed, but are going to be powering AI data centers and quantum. But it is going to take cooperation. I mean, if I were the South Koreans, not to get too negative on this, but I would look at the opportunity of, what we're doing and where we're cutting in terms of science and technology and research. This is a great opportunity to take those scientists, those researchers, those engineers. You have American technology. Hopefully the alliance holds. Hopefully the cooperation holds. That's in both of our interests. If we're not going to fund it, perhaps the South Koreans can. And again, that benefits both of us going forward.
But the key there, though, that's, I think, the right way to proceed. The key is whether
or not it does go
whether
that
the Trump
way.
administration will buy that. They don't seem to be big on the idea of cooperation in that sense. They seem very big on the idea of moving things here, doing things here. Trump is famous for not being a multilateralist and being a unilateralist on a host of things. And I think the idea of, we can advance the ball forward and have a win-win outcome for both countries, it's not something that comes easily to him, I don't think.
Yeah, so then it's worth asking the question, and you make a very good point. I'm going to jump to Victor here. It's worth asking the question, what is it about the UK-US partnership, both on the trade side, the prosperity deal, plus the parallel effort on the tech deal, that we could take as a potential lesson here for the Korean negotiators, for the US negotiators? Maybe it doesn't comport, but at the same time, there seems to be a lot that could be done on the tech side as well. What are your thoughts on that, Victor?
So I think everybody has studied the UK deal and are looking at how the Japanese are negotiating, and the Vietnam deal, although there doesn't appear to be a lot on paper on the Vietnam deal yet, so it's kind of hard to study it. And so the tech aspect, sure, I think there's a lot of opportunity the Koreans can learn from that. They can certainly propose, and they should propose something on these things that Erin just mentioned. But I think, like, I mean, what Bill says is right. If, like, someone were to go to Trump and say, look, there's a real opportunity for us to cooperate with the South Koreans on SMRs, with the Koreans, we can also help to define the rules, the global rules, the industry rules, the safety, the regulatory rules on this. Otherwise, the Chinese and the Russians will do it. Like, I don't think that part of the argument really resonates with Trump, because he's not really interested in that. I mean, and like, to say something is win-win, I also don't think that particularly resonates with Trump as well. I think one potential area really is on the tech side, is on sort of high-end defense industrial cooperation, like Erin mentioned, autonomous Navy assets, things of this nature, where there is a lot of work being done by Korean defense industries in this sort of space, and they are actively looking to market internationally. And this is something the Lee government, the current government, has said. K defense industry. They don't call there's K-pop. They call it K defense industry. I think it's terrible branding. But aside from that, that's something they aggressively want to do. And so, there may be opportunity there that Trump would see possible in terms of acquisition, that the Koreans would provide at subsidized rate, at discounted or subsidized rates to the United States, in everything from munitions to autonomous logistics to whatever it might be. So I think on that sort of side, that sort of high-tech aspect might be something that would be appealing to Trump. But I mean, it is, and I think work that you're doing and programs like this are important in terms of trying to change the terms of discussion on this, to move it away from simply being about like merchandise trade. Like merchandise trade is important, but it's clearly not everything. And who is it that our old friend Mike Green used to say? Merchandise trade is like dating, but foreign direct investment is like marriage, right? And so that's really the most important part of this, of reframing this discussion. So,
Bill, you were going to say something.
Well, yeah, I think Victor said something important that illustrates the conundrum that a lot of these countries face, particularly Korea, which is they're approaching this as a win-win possibility. And Minister Yo has been clear about that. We think that agreements should produce outcomes that are helpful for both sides. And that's the tradition of trade agreements. You give something, we give something. Right. For Trump's a zero-sum guy. Yeah. And his life in real estate has been zero-sum. I get to build a building, or you get to build a building, but we don't get to build a building together. Right. He doesn't approach, his approach is, I'm not really winning unless somebody is losing. And when somebody comes in and says there's a win-win outcome here, as Victor said, he's not really interested in win-win outcomes. He's interested in outcomes where we win visibly,
and certainly
the other guy doesn't.
The readouts from the Vietnam deal underscore that. However, like, in other words, we didn't give anything and they gave everything. Yes. But let me say this, and I see the time is coming near the end, so I want to get your overall perspective on where we go here. But let me put one more thing on the table. I actually think there is an interpretation here that the latest shift to August 1st is not so much a sign of great U.S. leverage, but a sign of the loss of U.S. leverage.
Agreed.
And if that is the case, like, let's just assume that that could be the case. And I'm not saying that the administration would be admitting that, but I'm just saying if that's the reality, then in fact that may be the basis for a pivot that says, okay, let's include services trade in this, a pivot that says, let's use technology in this, a pivot that says, okay, let's use defense tech as part of this deal. And the reason I look at the UK package, which includes trade and tech, and if I look at maybe what we've come out of the GCC with recently, there may be elements here that could respond to the challenge of, oh, you have a lot less leverage than you thought you had, so why don't you try this? What do you think about that? Maybe you start, and then we'll go to Victor and Erin.
Yeah. Well, I think you're making a good point. I mean, it's optimistic, and we'll see. But to me, what right now, and for the next couple of weeks, we're in this giant game of chicken. Trump clearly believes that he can bully them into submission.
Right.
That's the whole tactic here. If you look at it from a different perspective, though, the way this is beginning to play out, he's kind of painted himself into a corner. Once you shift the rhetoric from this is cost-free to Americans, the foreigners pay everything, which is what he said during the campaign. Once you acknowledge, as he did in March, that there's going to be a cost, and short-term cost, short-term pain for long-term gain, then once you say that, then it's on you to produce the gain.
Yeah.
So the situation Trump is in now is the tariffs are the cost, and the pain in the public's mind. The agreements are the gain. If you can't produce any agreements, that's one, a failure of strategy, and two, a failure of tactics. And that may be where we're going. I think Trump is gambling that the other countries will fold. The other countries, I think, are gambling that he's going to get nervous and realize that if he can't produce anything in his terms, then there's going to be political consequences domestically. And I'm not sure, I mean, you're suggesting that there's a way out if he's smart enough to take it, and you may well be right about that.
I'm just saying, what's the circuit breaker? And I don't know if there is one, but I think it's worth thinking of that scenario, even though I don't know what the probability of it is.
The alternative is you have a collision, and the tariff, at some point the tariffs, I think you can make, despite what he said, he'll probably extend the deadline again, at least for some people. But sooner or later, he's going to start imposing these things.
And from the U.S. negotiators' perspective, this can't be good because it just shows the loss of leverage.
Well, it means they fail. It means they failed. If they can't make a deal, they failed.
Right. Erin, what is your perspective on this?
I don't have many good things to say, but I mean, I completely agree with what Bill was saying, in that, there is no win-win. It's not, I win, I take everything, you just take whatever we give you, which is frankly not much. And when I look at the Vietnam deal, I mean, for them, a third of their export market is to the United States. So it is incredibly important for the Vietnamese to try to keep that open. But if you think of what they've been doing over the course of the last few months, and that includes the Japanese as well, who are not thrilled. The South Koreans, even though it's a relatively new government, they've been thinking about this for months. What are they getting out of this except for continued access to the U.S. market and just getting slapped in the face over and over? Trump likes a spectacle. He loves the headlines, but the goalposts keep getting moved, and his comments are much more chaotic in this term than they were in the first term, and that. Yeah, we're going to make a deal, and that's the deal. Whether it was USMCA or the next course renegotiation, where do we know where things end? If you negotiate a trade agreement, is that it? And there's not too many details, so we're going to run up into reality quite soon when businesses can't operate in this environment, countries can't operate in this environment. But does the divide and conquer tactics continue to work? And by that I mean, when you're just negotiating one-on-one, whether it's 90 deals in 90 days, you're going individually to countries. There's already discussions among other countries of banding together and trying to have a more unified front so they're able to work together and try to help spread the risk of the loss of the U.S. market. ASEAN is one example of that. Now, it's quite aspirational. It hasn't really happened before. But there's a discussion of how they, as a unified market, can better figure out how to develop their own economies without the United States. And they're not thrilled about China either, because they have their own issues with them. So does it mean increasing trade to the European Union? Is it working within those linkages that they've already set up through APEC in developing relationships with Latin America? Is it increasing trade with Japan and South Korea? With the Liberation Day announcements in April, you also saw China, Japan, and South Korea boggles the mind that they were starting to talk about how to cooperate more. Now, where that goes, it's unclear, but there's been plenty of anger. India was definitely along the lines of getting a trade deal, maybe one of the first out the gate, but other issues burbled up in terms of geopolitics. So, they're not exactly thrilled with what the U.S. is doing either. So, I'm a lot more pessimistic about this, that, it's America first, and it might end up being America alone because, we're not an autarky. We're headed that way, and we are going to run up against a harsh reality, I think.
Victor, loss of leverage as a circuit breaker for potentially something different in the negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, so I think and this resonates a little bit with what already's been said, but part of this is, or a big part of this is performative for Trump, right? So he could not extend the deadline from July 9th to August 1st. He could not just extend it, so he increased the tariffs, right? So that's sort of, that is sort of the way the game is played. But how many more times can he do that? And like you said, eventually he's going to we're going to reach a point where the United States needs to make a deal, right? I don't know how long that will take, but they'll need to make a deal. The UK deal happened because he needed to make a deal. Like, he needed to show that the Liberation Day tariffs were going to produce results, right? So he got a deal, and like you said, that was not just about like restricting. Well, it wasn't even restricting, but auto exports to the United States. There was a tech element to that too, a technology element to that too. So, perhaps we will eventually get to that point where the performative need for a deal by Trump will make him more open to listening to his advisors who tell them, like, there's real opportunities where we can push on digital, we can push on an AI stack, defense industrial cooperation, these sorts of things. The second point that I would make is that, all of these, Korea and Japan are like two of the most loyal allies the United States could possibly have, right? I mean, Korea has fought with the United States in every single war since the Korean War, right? Including Iraq and Afghanistan, although in Afghanistan it was peacekeeping operations. I mean, and they were a big supporter of Ukraine. So they have been good allies. The Japanese, as Erin knows, incredibly good allies in all respects, and they're both being treated like crap right now. Mm-hmm. And so there is this question of whether they will, even Korea and Japan will start to talk to each other, right? Whether they'll start to talk to each other, and with Canada and with others about how best to approach the United States. And if that were to happen, that could also sort of change the dynamics of this, where instead of the United States sort of sitting atop and saying, everybody come to me and give me everything I want, that that could be another thing that sort of changes the whole dynamics of this and causes the United States to be more willing to make a deal. But
a very good analysis, right now, but a sobering thought.
It doesn't look like it.
Yeah, a good analysis and a sobering thought. It's really interesting. A few months ago, Secretary Bessent had described what some called an encirclement strategy, that the allies would get together and cut a deal and then encircle China. We're in a very different place now. It seems like we might be getting encircled, or the U.S. And I would say that I'm going to remain a sort of a modest optimist in the sense that the political imperative of having to announce some form of deals and the ability of allies to hold back and wait may lead us to a point where there is a circuit breaker. And I think there, maybe the UK relationship or the UK agreement could potentially be a guidepost. Maybe there are others. But I think we have a lot to watch. And I think at the very least, there will be a lot of CSIS analyses underway over the next few weeks. At least we have until August 1st, Bill, to sharpen your pencil on that, and Erin as well. But I just want to thank all of you, Victor, from joining remotely, for both Bill and Erin, for this really very, very enriching discussion. And we really hope that we'll stay close to this, and we'll hope that there will be positive outcomes for the various parties involved. But as good analysts, we'll have to call balls and strikes. So with that, I'm going to ask our audience, please check out this. If you miss it live, check it out on YouTube and a lot of the other great research that Victor, Bill, and Erin are putting out on Korea and many other topics. So with that, have a great day, and we'll be watching the U.S.-Korea relationship as it evolves.